Okay, we're going to start. Good morning. This is our last meeting of the academic year. Our next meeting is on the 2nd of October, and that's a special meeting. As you know, once a year we award the Arnold Pfeffer Prize, and the recipient of the prize gives us a special lecture. This year, the Arnold Pfeffer Prize has been won by Gillespie and Cingulotomy, the mirror neuron taps, the mirror neuron duet, and Gillespie is going to come and receive the prize on their behalf and address us on the 2nd of October. I don't know what you're going to do on the first Saturday of every month until then. But today we're also ending the academic year with a special treat. Yoram Yovell was once one of us in the sense that he was once a New York boy. He worked here in Eric and Bell's labs, but unusually for neuroscientists, he also trained as an analyst at some other institute near here. I think it might start with a C. Columbus or something. He's also one of the founding members of the International Neuropsychoanalysis Society. Really one of our leading lights. He was the editor of our journal for a good few years. It made him bold to be editor. He's really something of a pop star, I think is the best way to describe his stature in Israel. He wrote a book, a sort of a neuropsychoanalytical case studies book, which sold God knows how many thousands of copies. And since then it became a household name there. Do you have a television show or something? Yes, he does. He has a television, his very own television show, which the rest of us can only imagine what that is like. He's as you can imagine, given his celebrity status, he has to be a good speaker. So we're not going to be disappointed when Professor Yoram Yovell talks to us about anxiety. And just so that you know his academic affiliations, he's a professor in the, I think it's called the Faculty of Health Sciences and Well-Being or something. Social well-being. They have departments like that in Israel. And he's also the co-director of the Institute for the Study of Affective Neuroscience, which is a really very promising, very, very interesting research center in our field in Israel, the University of Haifa. So please welcome back to New York City, the one and only Yoram Yovell.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark, very much for all these wonderful lies that you're telling about me. I can't resist reminiscing that when I was in New York City just a little over 10 years ago and getting ready to go back to Israel, and after having lived here for quite some time, and people were sort of looking at me in funny ways about why would I want to leave here and go back. And then I ran across someone who was living in London for a good many years and has done very well there, and then was ready to move back to South Africa, where he came from, which was also sort of a curious thing to do. And that guy's name was Mark Solms, and this is how we got to know each other. We looked at each other like we were fellow lunatics, So there we are. You're in South Africa. I went back there.
Can somebody make the mic a little louder?
Maybe just point it more towards your mouth, the mic.
Yeah.
This is
Bring it a little there.
19th century technology.
How's this?
Great.
Yeah, okay. So I should begin by saying that what I'm going to be talking about today is based on research, the vast majority of which I did not do. The only thing that I've had a hands-on experience with and connection to is really sort of a minor footnote in all that I'm going to show you here. And it's based on the one hand on psychoanalytic hypotheses that I think most of us are familiar with, and on some contemporary neuroscience, and some of the people who have been active in it are right here with us today, so maybe they would want to participate in the discussion if there's going to be one afterwards on what I'm going to show you. But I'd like to begin with the issue of anxiety from the psychoanalytic side. And the question that I'm going to try to address today is, do all anxieties ultimately derive from a single source? Is anxiety essentially one thing with many manifestations, or are there at least two fundamentally different kinds of anxiety? And that question has been around since the very beginning of psychoanalysis. When Freud readdressed anxiety in 1926 with his Inhibition, Symptoms, and Anxiety, where he offered his second theory of anxiety, he made an attempt to look at the connections between anxiety, pain, and object loss. And in Inhibition, Symptoms, and Anxiety, he asked the question, when does separation from an object produce anxiety? Well, when does it produce mourning, and when does it produce, it may be, only pain? And in order to try to answer this question, what he did is he looked at what he called the one situation which we believe we understand, the situation of the infant when it's presented with a stranger instead of its mother. Okay. And of course, that very paradigm, that very situation which he chose to look at was destined to become many years later the main clinical and research tool in which John Bowlby's attachment theory has been tested clinically. It was a paradigm that, so that's Bowlby, and it was a paradigm that was developed by the American developmental psychologist Mary Ainsworth, who was there too. And what I think I'll say things that are known to most of us, but I will repeat them, and I'll get into them a little bit. What the strange situation consists of is in sort of a you could call it a semi-structured interview. The child, usually the standard age in which this protocol is being used is around 12 months. A child is observed playing for 20 minutes, and the mother comes in, and the mother's with him in the beginning, then she leaves, then someone else comes in, and they leave. And the child's responses are often videotaped and recorded and then analyzed. And so the situation could be stressful, it often is stressful. Maybe I should describe to you how the thing works, because it has relevance to what we're going to talk about later on. So the way this standard strange situation begins is by the mother and the child being together in a room with many sort of toys, things to interact with, and there's a stranger, usually a graduate student, always a woman, sitting in another chair next to where the mother and the infant sit, but not trying to engage the child. And then the mother and the child play for a while, and after a while, the mother, with no warning, just gets up and leaves the room. And what happens then is that the vast majority of children begin to cry, and then the stranger comes and tries to console the child, and she plays with the child. After a while, the mother comes back in, and the mother and child reunite. Then the stranger leaves, okay, as the mother plays with the children. Then the mother leaves again, this time leaving the child all alone, okay, and then the child, fends for her or himself in that room. After a while, the stranger comes back in and tries to engage with the child, and subsequently the mother comes in, and then the ordeal is over, okay. So this is the paradigm. And the important thing to realize about this is that the behavior, this turned out to be something that's very close to a biological variable, because of all the many different psychological tests and variables that we monitor in cognitive psychology. Apparently, this is something that's very, very close to biological variable, in that the behavior of the child in that paradigm that I just described to you is highly predictive of his or her pattern of relationships for many years to come. And Mary Ainsworth and Mary Main, her colleague, have described three basic, then Main added a fourth type of attachment, which is irrelevant for us. But Ainsworth described three main types of attachment. One is the secure attachment, and what happens, the way it's characterized is when the mother leaves, the child would cry and protest, but when the stranger comes in and tries to engage with him or her, then they would eventually sort of start playing with the stranger. But the moment the mother comes back, the child will leave the stranger, run to the mother, hug her, and you know, take on from there. And then Ainsworth described two other patterns of attachment, which are insecure attachment. One of them is the insecure resistant, which is a child, or hyperactivating, in which situation, after the mother, everything's fine as long as the mother's in the room. After the mother leaves the room, the child becomes very, very upset and protests and cries and would not be consoled, is not consoled by the stranger. And when the mother re-enters the room, you know, the child cries even more and hugs the mother and will be even more resistant to parting from her subsequently. That's one pattern of insecure attachment. The other type of insecure attachment is the avoidant or deactivating type. And what happens there is, as long as the mother's in the room, everything's okay. The mother leaves the room, the infant is not terribly perturbed, goes on playing with him or herself. When engaged by the stranger, they're quickly comforted and they would play with the stranger. And then when the mother comes back in, the child would very often ignore her, you know, not pay attention to her. And I want to emphasize that all these three patterns of attachment are considered normal. Okay, that you see them, the secure. I think that the percentage of secure attachment is about 40 to 50% of the population. 15 to 20% show the resistant type. Another 10 to 15% show the avoidant type, the deactivating type, and then there's another 10% of babies and kids who show what Main later called the disorganized type, which is a mixture of the above. But the point that's important to us is that the child's behavior is characterized by this test is highly predictive of the pattern of relationship that child is going to have with friends, with lovers, with really every significant person in their lives for the rest of their lives. I don't think I'm exaggerating. There are probably hundreds, not dozens, but hundreds of PhD theses that were written on this strange situation. And I think the reason is because it monitors something that's very, very close to the biology. And I'm going to come back to that later. Okay, so going back to Freud, after he described what happens when this happens to a child, when he's faced with a stranger, he said that in addition to the unmistakable anxiety that the infant or the child experiences in this situation, his facial expression and his crying suggest that he also feels pain in response to the mother's loss. This is Freud. And Freud went on to say that later on in her life, the infant will come to realize that the much more common and real danger is not the loss of the mother, but the loss of the mother's love. And this too will become a very reliable trigger of anxiety for the rest of the person's life. Okay, so then Freud asked, what is the source of the pain that gives separation anxiety its special flavor, its special taste, which distinguishes it, at least experientially, from other types of anxiety? And he hypothesized that the pain that's related to the existence of an object, and the threat, the loss of the object, or the threat of the loss of the object, triggers the anxiety. And he differentiated that painful type of anxiety from what he called pure anxiety, which is felt when the stimulus that provokes it is not related to a beloved object. And that, of course, left him with the question of what to do with the famous castration anxiety, in the scheme. And so he deliberated this way and the other, and finally he decided that castration anxiety is also painful because it involves a threat of separation from a very beloved object. And that's the way he left it. Okay. So to summarize, Freud's view of anxiety in this context was that it originates from several different it may originate from several different internal external sources, and that it manifests in one of two experiential forms. On the one hand, you have anxiety that's without pain, and that's when it's not related to object loss. According to Freud, interesting, the anxiety of birth, he was very much influenced by Rank at that time. The anxiety of birth was an example, and he stated that this kind of anxiety may be extremely unpleasant, but it's not painful. Okay? And on the other hand, he described a second type of anxiety, a second flavor of anxiety, which is painful anxiety, and that's when it's directly or indirectly linked to an object. For example, and the prime example is, of course, separation anxiety, or fear of the loss of blood. He said that's painful anxiety. Okay, and I just couldn't resist bringing this quote from Civilization, Its Discontents, about how this anxiety shapes our lives. So Freud wrote there, "What is more natural than that we should persist in looking for happiness along the path on which we first encounter it, and that is along the path of object love, of loving someone we care for." And he said, "The weak side of this technique of living is easy to see, otherwise no human being would have thought of abandoning this path to happiness for any other. It is that we are never so defenseless against suffering as when we love, never so helplessly unhappy as when we have lost our loved object or its love." And that is, of course, his beloved daughter, Sophie, who died in the flu epidemic of 1919. And I think he mourned her for the rest of his life. Okay, to move forward. So Melanie Klein, as I think we all know, made anxiety the hallmark, the linchpin of her psychoanalytic metapsychology. And she developed, expanded, some would say transformed, Freud's views on anxiety. And specifically, she offered a fundamental distinction that I think, again, we're all familiar with, between, on the one hand, what she called paranoid anxiety, which is fear of annihilation. And on the other hand, depressive anxiety, which is fear of the loss of the beloved object or the loss of their love. And this distinction between paranoid and depressive anxiety is fundamental to Klein's developmental metapsychology and her clinical psychology as well. So, broadly speaking, looking at the history of psycholytic thought, it appears that within the mainstream of contemporary psychoanalysis, there are two general views regarding the origins of anxiety and its experiential manifestations. On the one hand, we have many theoreticians who consider anxiety to be a single emotion with many manifestations that all share a common basis. And into that category, we can put Rank with his anxiety of birth. We can put Winnicott, Fairbairn, Guntrip, Bowlby, who sort of correlated everything, at least initially, to his separation anxiety. Kohut, who talked of the fear of disintegration as being the primal fear, the primal anxiety from which all other anxieties stem, etc. So despite the fact that all these theoreticians had very different things to say about what is that one fundamental anxiety, how do you define it, where it comes from, etc., they did agree that anxiety is in essence one thing that can later have many different manifestations. There's one underlying entity, which is the way that they describe their anxiety, and all the different ways in which people experience and express their anxiety are derived from that one single source. And on the other hand, there was the view that was formulated by Klein and then elaborated and propagated by the Kleinians, Siegel, Meltzer, others, who viewed anxiety as two different and distinct experiential phenomena that arise from two separate developmental sources. Okay? So these are generally the two views on anxiety that we have. And the point that I would like to make is that this purely psychoanalytic controversy may be enriched and perhaps clarified by looking from the neuropsychoanalytic perspective on the relationships between anxiety, pain, and object loss. And this is what I'm going to try to do from now on. Okay? And the place where I would like to begin to do this is to begin with Jaak Panksepp's emotional command systems. So after many years of working on the subject, Panksepp, in his 1998 book, Affective Neuroscience, integrated his own findings, as well as the findings of others, other affective neuroscientists, and he described 4 distinct emotional command systems that are localized in the human and mammalian limbic system. And what he meant by emotional command systems is here are neural structures that generate and mediate and manifest the core emotions that we as humans have and which we share with our fellow mammals. And 2 of these functional systems mediate feelings of anxiety in Panksepp's scheme. One is the system that he called the fear system, and the other is the system that he called the panic system. And I'm going to be devoting most of the rest of my talk to describing these 2 systems, and at the very end I'll try to come back to the psychoanalytic issue that I've just raised and see how what we may learn from looking at these 2 systems might be relevant to our psychoanalytic controversy. Okay. So this is Jaak here, and we have the live person sitting right here before us, and this is a figure taken from his book, and I put it on here for the purpose of alerting you to the fact that what I'm going to be talking about is a vast oversimplification, because the way I'm going to be presenting those systems is if they're totally separate, and although they are independent, and I'll show you the evidence for that, they can and they do influence each other. So what we get in real life is an activation or upregulation, downregulation, joint activation of these systems together. So what I'm going to show you is really an oversimplification. Okay, in real life these systems are intertwined. However, they can be teased apart anatomically and behaviorally, and that's what I'm going to emphasize. Okay. Okay, so just because most of what I'm going to show from now onwards is going to be based on findings in animals, what I wanted to start with is sort of a human, there are many human studies that correlate with these findings and verify them. But I wanted to show this slide, which is taken from a study by DiMaggio in the year 2000, just to see that we do have human correlates to those systems that were originally described in animals. DiMaggio did this study looking at the FDG PET activation of human brain when subjects are instructed to think about nothing in particular, whatever that may be, as opposed to experiencing an emotion. And DiMaggio took people who I think that we would probably label as just looking at the description of his research subjects, we would probably label them as histrionic or being a little bit on the histrionic side. People who could get very emotional very quickly. They had to write narratives from their own lives that would be meaningful for them, either sad or happy or angry or fearful. And then they recorded those, they read these things out loud, it was recorded, and then when they were in the PET scanner, those things were played back to them. And this is a quote, this is a direct quote from the DiMaggio paper, quote unquote, all subjects cried in the sadness condition. So he made sure that these people are really experiencing and exhibiting those emotions. And what you see here are the results, are the classic way that these findings are shown. There's subtraction studies, subtracting the baseline, again, whatever that may be, activity, to the activity that was manifest when the subjects were experiencing those emotions. And I think what you can see if you look, so the top, in each one of those panels, the top two images are the surface of the brain, the cortex, and the bottom images are a mid-sagittal slice through the brain, showing really the more ancient middle parts. And yellow going on to red is relative activation, and blue going on to violet is deactivation. And what you can see, looking at these 4 different emotional patterns, you can see that A, they differ from each other, and B, that as a general rule, you see activation in subcortical, in the more ancient parts of the brain, and if you see anything at all on the cortex, it's usually deactivation. Okay? And that's an important thing that I'm going to come to later on. Yeah. So looking at all these figures, you can see, I don't know what you may muse on what it means that when we're happy, the newest, most sophisticated parts of our cortex are being shut down. The prefrontal association cortex, the heteromodal cortices of the back of the brain, these things show deactivation. But important to us, during the sadness condition, we see a strong activation of distinct parts of the older brain, here and here. We see the same pattern of subcortical activation in fear, in anger, and as I said before, to some extent also in happiness. Okay? So just to go over, this is not a neuroanatomy lesson, but just to go over the main structures that I'm going to be talking about from now on. They have to do with the human limbic system. We're going to be talking about this here is the corpus callosum, and we're going to be talking about the cingulate gyrus, the hippocampus, the amygdala, here's the mammillary bodies, the fornix, and the basal forebrain nuclei that also belong to the limbic system. And these are the structures that those emotional command systems that I described have mapped onto. And from these four systems, from the four systems that Jaak described, which are seeking, fear, anger, and panic, I'm going to talk about two. I'm going to leave the others aside. I'm going to talk about the fear system and the panic system. So the fear system. The fear system is an ancient system. It's found in reptiles. It's been with us for a long time. And it appears to be an all-purpose alarm system that warns against basic existential threats. Fear of heights, fear of predators, fear of fire, fear of snakes, things like that. And I think those of you who studied cognitive psychology probably heard about it as the fight or flight system. And I should say that it activates the autonomic response that we associate with fight or flight, mostly the sympathetic activation, with an emphasis on flight rather than fight. Okay? We know quite a lot about its anatomy and physiology. We know that it's triggered by activity in the central and lateral nuclei of the amygdala. In this, you can't see the resolution, but you could see an activation of the amygdala, and this is from an fMRI study that showed fearful stimuli to subjects. We know something. We know much more about the microanatomy and the physiology of the amygdala, and we know this is sort of an overgeneralization, but we know that the central and lateral nuclei of the amygdala are involved in the fear system, and the medial and to some extent the basal nuclei of the amygdala are involved in the rage system that mediates anger, hot aggression. And we know something about the neurotransmitters. Again, it's an oversimplification. There are many transmitters and many interneurons involved in the system, but we know the two of them are glutamate and GABA. And relevant to that, we know, and we use it as clinicians, we use it almost every day, that the fact that the action of this fear system can be inhibited by benzodiazepine drugs, all of which are indirectly acting GABA agonists, things like Valium, Xanax, Klonopin, Ativan, etc., Halcion. These are all benzodiazepines, and this is the method, this is where we presume they work in reducing anxiety and fear. Okay, so now to move on to the panic system. This is really the system that's concerned with anxiety, pain, and loss. And in contrast to the fear system, which is from a developmental biological perspective is ancient, the fear system is relatively recent. It's been around for 120, 130 million years roughly. It's relatively new from an evolutionary perspective. It's common to all mammals and to all birds. In general, it's common to animals that have strong social bonds between parent and infant, usually the mother, and also strong social bonds between members of the group, of the species. And what it does, the main thing that it does is it mediates separation anxiety and separation distress. You can already hear by what I said that the panic system maps on very beautifully to Bowlby's attachment system. And indeed, if we take Bowlby and read him, him without being aware of the neuroanatomy and neurophysiology of what we know now about the panic system. What he had to say about his postulated attachment systems maps on beautifully well to what we know about the panic system. The panic system mediates the fear, the distress, the panic associated with separation between mother and infant. And it's triggered, we know something again about the anatomy and the physiology. It's triggered by activity in the anterior cingulate gyrus, here, as well as parts of the thalamus and the hypothalamus. It radiates down to the periaqueductal gray, like all four of Panksepp emotional command systems. And again, the biochemistry is complicated, but we know that the neurotransmitters involved in it are endorphins, serotonin, oxytocin, prolactin, and others. And again, important to our work as clinicians, we know that its action can be inhibited, at least partially, by the SSRI antidepressants, things like Prozac, Paxil, Luvox, citalopram, etc., as well as by narcotics. And when I mentioned that a small part of what I'm going to show you today has to do with research that I myself am involved with, this is the part that I'm involved with. And I'm going to be talking now a little bit about narcotics as pain medications, and narcotics about antidepressants. So again, I think as many of you are aware, until the onset of the MAOIs and the tricyclic antidepressants, narcotics were routinely used in psychiatry as potent antidepressants. Kreplin, in his textbook of psychiatry, which is just now a little bit over 100 years ago, it was published in 1904, devoted a lot of space to talking about the use of narcotics as antidepressants, said that they're very potent antidepressants, that they can be used, that once you achieve remission, you should taper them very carefully. He was aware of the danger of addiction, but he described them as very useful antidepressants. And when you read the psychiatric literature until the 50s, you see that there's a lot of data and a lot of information about using narcotics as antidepressants. And all these things came to a halt in the late 50s, understandably, because once we had the MAOIs and the first tricyclics, those were preferable because they were not associated with such a big risk of addiction. And the use of narcotics as antidepressants virtually came to a halt. And in 1995, Bodkin, a psychopharmacologist, published a study in which he documented the use of a particular narcotic agonist-antagonist called buprenorphine for the treatment of depression, showing that it's a very powerful, it was a case series, showing that it's a very, very powerful antidepressant, either on its own or as an add-on. Now, buprenorphine is an interesting molecule because it is both a mu receptor agonist, and mu is the main receptor through which narcotics and the endorphins, which are the natural analogs of these narcotics in the brain, exert their influence. But on higher doses, buprenorphine is also an antagonist. It becomes an antagonist with those very same receptors. And what that means is that it's much harder to get addicted to it, because as you increase the dose, you don't get more of an effect, but you lose the effect you already had. And the other thing which is very important is it makes it safe to use, because all the regular narcotics are very, very good suicide medications. I think that when people think of committing suicide, what they're really thinking of is a narcotic overdose, because what happens is you take the drug, and then you feel very peaceful and very pleasant and very sleepy, and then you fall asleep, and then you stop breathing. And it's no coincidence that when physicians commit suicide, they often do it with narcotics, because they're very good medications to kill yourself with. And that's another reason why psychiatrists are, I think, appropriately very reluctant to give narcotics as antidepressants, especially to suicidal patients. But again, because of the mu antagonism, buprenorphine is not a suicide drug. It's very, very hard to kill yourself with buprenorphine, because if you overdose on it, it won't put you to sleep, it won't suppress breathing, etc. So I've talked about narcotics as antidepressants, but as we all know, narcotics are the most potent pain medications that we have. And what I'd like to show you now, that association is not coincidental. That the fact that the most potent medications that we have for the treatment of pain are also powerful antidepressants. Okay, so again, I'll state the obvious. Separation anxiety and social rejection are painful. This is sort of a review paper by Naomi Eisenberger and Matthew Lieberman, who are two researchers who've done a lot of work on this subject. And what they propose is a common the existence of a common neural alarm system for physical and social pain. And I would say that their system overlaps to a great extent with what Paxep calls the panic system. And one of the ways, I'll show you the results of an fMRI study that they did looking at the neural correlates of activation of that system. But I want to get into that in some detail because I find it so cute, the experiment that they did. And the question is, suppose we want to look at the neural correlates of social rejection, right? So we want to have someone's brain imaged as they experience social rejection. Now, I don't know how many of you have ever spent some time in an MRI machine, but those who had will remember this is a very claustrophobic experience. You lie like that. It's a very noisy thing. You're not allowed to move. You're stuck well inside. How do you get someone to feel, to reliably trigger social rejection under those conditions, okay? And the nice thing is that Eisenberger and Lieberman were able to do that. And the way they did it, is they put their subjects into the fMRI. They put a mirror over their head so they could look up into it. They couldn't move. And they put a mouse, a computer mouse, in their hand that they were allowed to move a little bit. Okay? And then they filmed this cartoon on the screen, which the subject saw. And on that cartoon, you saw these two cartoon figures that were playing ball with each other, so throwing the ball back and forth between the two of them. And for now and then, the cartoon figures would throw the picture at the subject. The subject had a cartoon hand that was activated by the mouse that they were holding, and the subject would then use the mouse to catch the ball and throw it to one of the two cartoon players. And so the three of them were playing ball with each other for a few minutes, okay, just throwing it back and forth. Now, at some point, unbeknownst to the subject and not settled with him beforehand, these two cartoon figures stop throwing the ball at him or at her, okay? They throw it to each other, but they don't throw it at him at all. And after a little while, the subject realizes that they're not playing with him anymore. They don't want to play with him anymore. And what Eisenberger and Lieberman asked is, what is the pattern of neural activity at that moment? Okay? When the subject realizes that they're excluded, that those two buddies don't want to play with them anymore. Okay? And what they found is they found increased activation in the dorsal part of the anterior cingulate gyrus. And what this slide shows is that once the subjects were taken out of the scanner and they were given a questionnaire where they were asked, how bad did you feel? How hurt were you? When this happened, on a scale of 1 to 10, how bad was it? The results of their answers on the questionnaire, that is, how severe did they experience their own distress by this, correlated with the strength of the signal here. Okay? So the more upset you felt when you were excluded from the game, the stronger your relative activation was in the dorsal part of the anterior cingulate gyrus. Okay. So I talked about the anterior cingulate and the pain of social exclusion. I'm now going to talk about the anterior cingulate and physical pain. Again, this is an oversimplification. The anterior cingulate is a very, very complicated structure in the brain. It has to do with many cognitive, with many conscious and unconscious processes in the brain, having to do with conflict resolution, change detection, stuff like that. I'm not going to go into it. I'm just going to talk about the two things that are of interest to us now, about the social rejection / sadness that I talked about, and the physical pain. So the anterior cingulate, which is involved in separation distress and transient sadness, these are studies by Helen Mayberg, transient sadness, as well as clinical major depression, is also involved in the processing and the perception of physical pain. And as a matter of fact, neurosurgeons sometimes are asked by internists, by pain doctors, to carry out cingulotomies, which are surgical. It can be done also by gamma rays without actually slicing the brain. But sometimes it's done physically, surgically. A disconnection of the anterior cingulate, a procedure that's called cingulotomy, is a last-ditch treatment for intractable physical pain. When people who have metastatic cancer or people who have those terrible rheumatic syndromes are no longer responsive to narcotics, are barely responsive to narcotics, the last resort treatment that they would get is a cingulotomy. and they very often work. And it's interesting for us to note that the very same operation, the very same surgical procedure, a cingulotomy, is also a last resort treatment for intractable major depression that does not respond to any of the medications that we have into ECT. And again, these are people who've failed multiple trials of medication. Sometimes they would be referred to those cingulotomies, and they're successful in over 50% of the cases in alleviating the depression. The very same operation. So in Panksepp's nosology, if we want to think of what these people underwent, they underwent a lesion in their panic system which spared their fear system. And of course, the question that would be relevant for us as psychoanalysts would be, what would be the experiential taste of that? How would that feel like to have your panic system paralyzed or taken out and leaving your fear system intact? What would that feel like? And I'm not aware of any psychoanalytic studies that have taken people like that into psychotherapy and have looked into their inner world, their inner experience, their object relations, etc. Okay? But we do know something, not a psychoanalytic description, but we do know something about how these people at least appear on the outside. And this is a quote from the Eisenberger and Lieberman paper. Common to both animal and human cingulotomy patients is a reduced concern for social connection, characterized by either less affiliative behaviors in animals or less caution within social interactions in humans. Okay? So, in other words, when you get a lesion in your panic system that does not affect your fear system, it makes you A, less anxious about social rejection, B, less dependent on social bonds, and C, it does not touch your fear of heights, your fear of fires, etc. Okay? That's the phenotype. That's how it appears. So now I want to ask the sort of the opposite question. What about the opposite situation? Can you have a lesion in your fear system that would not affect your panic system? And if so, what would that look like? Okay? And we actually do know something about how individuals like that look like, and the person that I'm going to be describing now comes from a study by Antonio DiMaggio, who called her patient S. And Ms. S, and we see axial and coronal slices from her brain, from a structural MRI here, suffered from a rare hereditary disorder that's called Urbach-Witte disorder. It's a genetic disease that has to do with calcium deposits that accumulate in various parts of the body. In the brain, although it's not totally specific to the amygdala, for reasons that people don't understand, as far as I know, it's preferential for the amygdala. So we do see patients who've had this disease for a while who have calcium deposits in their amygdala that totally destroy their amygdala. And this is actually what you see here. Here you see control subjects. This is the coronal section. This is the axial section. This and this, and when you look through the coronal section, you see the amygdala nuclei here, and looking at this section, which slices about the middle of the temporal lobes here, you see them here and here. If you look at patient S, where the amygdala should have been, there's cerebrospinal fluid here, and here, and here, and here. Now, what is this person like? Okay, so again, DiMaggio and his colleagues describe it. This is not her, and this is obviously not her. These are emotional faces. These are standard faces that are shown in cognitive psychology to volunteers who are then asked to describe them. What's the emotion that they see? How trustworthy are these people, etc., etc. And there's standard scores for a library of these faces. So DiMaggio and his colleagues described this woman. They studied her the way that neurologists or neuropsychologists would study someone. They found that her basic intelligence was not affected, but that she lost the ability to identify the expression of fear and also anger on other people's faces. Now, every time you look you find something like this, the question comes to, is this really an inability to discern the emotion and to express it, or is it a perceptual or motor disturbance? Okay, if you want to take the example, think of Parkinson's disease, where people have hypomimia. You know, it's difficult for them to express their emotions on their face. Does that mean that they don't experience those emotions? Not necessarily. Okay, So whenever we see something in neuropsychology where people fail to register or to manifest an emotion, you have to ask, is that a perceptual problem, or is that a problem in the core system that mediates this emotion or whatever it is that you're studying? And to cut a long story short, DiMaggio and his colleagues showed that no matter what modality they tried to see, for example, hearing sounds that would be fearful or anger-provoking, seeing faces, hearing stories, etc., that no matter what the perceptual modality would be, S could reliably not be able to identify or to express those feelings, whereas she was perfectly able to identify and express other kinds of feelings. Okay? So it hints to the fact that probably the lesion, the amygdala lesion, is not a perceptual lesion. It's not a lesion in the perceptual processes that lead to the experiencing of this emotion, but has somehow injured the core emotional circuit itself. And very importantly, what she also lost, and this had a terrible influence on her life, she lost the ability to tell suspicious people from trustworthy people, which is not a good thing to have. Okay, so my fellow Americans, as they say. This is a quote. This is a quote from DiMaggio's paper. They talked about patient S. They said she was forthcoming and trusting in an extraordinary and inappropriate way. She very much wanted to form a connection with anyone who struck up a conversation with her. She did not refrain from hugging, kissing, and touching people she had met only recently. She formed new friendships easily, entered romantic relationships without difficulty, and was often taken advantage of by those she had trusted. Now, when that happened, she was hurt and upset. She was not at all indifferent to being abandoned, to being abused, to being mistreated by these people. But at the same time, she was anxious to avoid separation with these people, even when the consequences of staying with them were harmful to her, patently harmful to her. On the other hand, she completely lost the feeling of fear in everyday life. Last year I met Antonio DiMaggio and I asked him specifically about this patient and because this is not his nosology, the nosology that he uses every day, the fear, the panic system. I asked him specifically about patient S's experience of fear. And he thought about it for a while, and then he told me that it's interesting, but now that I mention it, that S did tell him that when she sees a car coming at her in the street, she says she knows she should get out of the way, and actually she does, but she's told him, I don't feel scared at all. I don't have any fear when I do that. Okay, so what I'd like to do now is I'd like to return to the question that we started with initially about anxiety. Let me just summarize and spell out the phenomenological evidence for the existence of two quote-unquote separate anxiety systems. Okay? We seem to have two basic types of anxiety, just based on descriptions by Freud and by Klein. There's the anxiety that's associated with the fear of the loss of object, which we experience as painful, what Klein called depressive anxiety, and those associated with the fear of existential threats, paranoid anxiety. So much we know, but again, that in and of itself does not answer the question, are these two fundamentally different things, or are they just different manifestations of one thing? Okay? But based on lesion studies, like the one that I showed you, we know that you can have one without the other, and vice versa. So that you can have a lesion that damages what appears like your paranoid anxieties. You no longer have those fears of annihilation, fears of being run over by a truck, falling from heights, etc., etc. But you do have the painful fear of being separated or mistreated or losing the love of someone you love. That remains. And the other way around as well, that you can lose one and not the other. Cingulotomy patients don't get run over by trucks, okay? But their emotional lives and their object relations get flattened to some extent. More about that we don't really know, as I said, because there are no good psychoanalytic studies of such patients, but we're going to have them. And importantly, there are neurobiological and neuropsychoanalytic findings that suggest that there are two separate anxiety systems. And again, I've gone over these things, I just want to spell them out here. On the one hand, there are different anatomical loci and different neural pathways. the panic system is localized to the anterior cingulate. Again, that's an oversimplification, but we know that that's a core key nucleus of that system, while the fear system is localized to the amygdala. We know that there are different neurotransmitter systems, and this has applications to psychopharmacology. We know that the panic system responds to endorphins, narcotics, serotonin, SSRIs, etc. And we know that the fear system responds to benzodiazepines, which are those indirectly acting GABA agonists. We know that there are different pharmacological treatments. I went over that. But what about the psychoanalytic differences? What's it like to be one or the other, to not have one or not have the other? What would the quality of object relations, sense of self, feeling of anxiety, defensive organization of people like Miss S would be like? What would their transference be like in psychoanalysis? And the same question, what about the object relations, sense of self, feelings of anxiety, defensive organization, transference paradigms of people who underwent anterior cingulotomies would be in treatment? We don't know, the short answer is we don't know the answer to that one, but there's work in progress. Right now in South Africa, in the University of Cape Town, our colleague Yuri Fodor is doing a study looking at several patients with Urbach-Witte disease, that same disease that the patient S had that wiped out her amygdala, trying to look at them in psychoanalytically oriented psychotherapy, trying to see what kind of people they are, what is their experience like in a psychoanalytic treatment. Okay, I'm coming to the end, so I will just add that the possible interpretations of the findings that I showed you and the correlation of them with psychoanalytic theories and their relevance for the psychoanalytic understanding of the subjective experience of anxiety and fear and psychic pain as they are expressed in our consulting room, as their experiences in people's lives, are very complex issues which require careful consideration. That is how we transpose what we've learned from the electrophysiology and lesion studies and neurochemistry and neuroethology to our psychoanalytic theories. How we do that transition is a delicate, sensitive issue that's fraught with complications. Okay? However, I have to state that I believe that it can and should be done with all the relevant precautions, but it can and should be done. And when you do that, I think it's hard to escape the finding that these findings that I've showed you seem to support the Freudian idea that was later expanded and elaborated by Klein. And I should put into parentheses here that you could say many things about me, but I think one thing that you cannot absolutely say about me is that I'm a Kleinian. I am not. Okay? But I have to say that I think that in this distinction, for example, I do not seriously buy her developmental trajectory that suggests that you know, we are at first sort of, when we come into the world, we're at the mercy of these paranoid anxieties, these paranoid aggressive wishes to devour the breast, etc., and only later do we sink into the depressive position. As a matter of fact, there are many reasons to think that that developmental scheme is not correct. All right? However, her fundamental distinction between anxieties that have to do with annihilation, what she called paranoid anxieties, and anxieties that have to do with the loss of an object or the loss of its love, what she called depressive anxiety, that distinction is not only eminently clinically useful, but is correct on a neurobiological level, that she was onto something that appears to be wired into our brains. And that's basically the main message or the main result that I wanted to share with you. And that's it. Thank you very much.